December 10th, 2009. Rick Rypien fought Boris Volobik, trading punches with a man far bigger than him. But he wasn't just fighting Volobik. He was fighting something that had been beating him for years.
Friends, and he had professional help. But in the end, his problems were too much.
By 27, he couldn't get back up.
I can remember going home the night of August 15th, 2011, and putting my phone in the same place, but I turned it off.
This isn't a hockey story, not really. This is about what happens when we tell someone to be tough for so long that they forget they're allowed to break. Rick Rypien grew up in Coleman, Alberta, a small community of about 1,000 people tucked into the Crow's Nest Pass in the Canadian Rockies. His father, Wes Sr., was a Canadian boxing champion, and Rick grew up idolizing guys like Wendell Clark and Eric Lindros, players who combined skill with fearlessness. He followed his older brother Wes Jr. into hockey, and by the time he was a teenager, everyone in that tight-knit mountain knew Rick was going to chase the NHL with everything he had. But here's what nobody outside his family knew. During his second season with the Regina Pats in the Western Hockey League, Rick's girlfriend, Courtney, was driving to Calgary to watch him play when she was involved in a fatal car accident on the highway. Rick was still a teenager, and according to Craig Heisinger, the man who would later become one of his closest friends in professional hockey, Rick could never let go of the guilt. He carried the weight of that loss with him for the rest of his life, convinced that if the team hadn't been playing in Calgary that night, Courtney would still be alive. Despite that pain, Rick kept pushing. He captained the Pats, won the team's Most Valuable Player award, and was voted the fans' favorite, and racked up nearly 500 penalty minutes across 178 games. But when the 2004 NHL entry draft came around, not a single team selected him. Rick Rypien went completely undrafted. For most players, that would have been the end. Rick treated it as the beginning. Heisinger, who was running the Manitoba Moose in the American Hockey League at the time, had been scouting another player entirely when Rick caught his eye. He offered Rick an amateur tryout for the end of the 2004-05 season, and Rick played 8 regular season games before helping the Moose reach the conference finals and the playoffs. That tryout turned into a contract, and by November of 2005, the Vancouver Canucks signed him to a 2-way deal. On December 21st, Rick made his NHL debut against the Edmonton Oilers, and in the first period, on his very first shift, he scored his first NHL goal on his first shot. The kid from Coleman, population 1,000, undrafted, undersized, and carrying more grief than anyone in that arena knew about, had just announced himself to the biggest stage in hockey. But making it was only half the problem. Staying there was something else entirely. Rick's role on the Canucks was the fourth line, and his job was simple in theory and brutal in practice. He existed to protect the team's skilled players by absorbing and delivering punishment and fighting opponents who dwarfed him. Guys like Hal Gill at 6'7" and 240 pounds, or Sheldon Brookbank at 6'2" and 215. Every game was another audition, and the unwritten code of that role demanded that you never turn down a challenge, never show pain, and never let anyone see you struggle. Rick followed that code to the letter, and it was already starting to cost him more than anyone around him understood. The 2009-10 season was actually the healthiest stretch of Rick's career. 69 games without a major injury, a career-high 8 points. On paper, things looked stable, but the 2010-11 season opened on a completely different note, and everything fell apart in a single night. October 19th, 2010. Canucks at Minnesota Wild, XL Energy Center in St. Paul. This was Rick's first game of the new season, and early in the first period, he dropped the gloves with Wild forward Brad Staubitz, a 6'1", 215-pound enforcer who had been scrapping the league for years. The two went at it hard, and both ended up in the box. Then, in the second period, they lined up against each other again, ready to go a second time. But the linesman stepped in and separated them before anything could start. Rick was given a double minor and a 10-minute misconduct and was sent off the ice toward the tunnel leading to the Canucks dressing room. That's when it happened. A 28-year-old Wild fan named James Engvist was sitting near the runway, and as Rick walked past, Engvist started mock applauding and called out, "Way to be a professional." Rick snapped. He reached up and grabbed Engvist by the jersey, pulling him toward the tunnel before head coach Alain Vigneault and teammate Manny Malhotra rushed in and pulled Rick away. The whole thing lasted a few seconds, but every camera in the building caught it. The NHL suspended Rick for 6 games and fined the Canucks $25,000. Commissioner Gary Bettman personally called Engvist to apologize and offered him dinner and tickets to another game. The headlines wrote themselves. Rick Rypien out of control. Rick Rypien unhinged. What almost nobody reported was the context behind that moment. Years later, Canucks general manager Mike Gillis would acknowledge that the fan incident could not be separated from what Rick was going through personally. NHL Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly confirmed the same thing, saying he believed the incident was very much related to Rick's broader struggles and that the commissioner had taken that into account during sentencing. But here's what the media missed. The fight everyone remembers wasn't against Staubitz, it was against himself, and he was losing. After serving his suspension, Rick couldn't hold a regular spot in the lineup and became a frequent healthy scratch. By late November 2010, the Canucks granted him his second personal leave of absence. Media speculation about his mental health was now widespread, but the organization stayed quiet, protecting Rick's privacy while trying to figure out how to help a player whose biggest opponent had never laced up skates. Rick's second leave stretched from late November 2010, deep into the winter, and then into the spring. This wasn't like the first time where he disappeared for a stretch and came back with cautious optimism. This absence lasted months, and the silence around it grew louder with every week he was gone. During this period, the people closest to Rick were doing everything they could. Kevin Bieksa and his wife Katie had already opened their home to Rick during his first leave, staying up with him through the worst nights. In an interview years later, Bieksa described what that looked like in plain terms, saying he could think of at least 20 separate occasions where they sat up with Rick until 5 in the morning, just listening to him talk about how he was feeling, doing it over and over again, believing it would help. Bieksa's young son had a particular ability to reach Rick when no one else could, pulling him out of dark stretches simply by being around him. But even that kind of support had limits. Rick's brother Wes later admitted that he didn't handle things the right way during this time, often defaulting to telling Rick to man up, an attitude that had taken both of them far in hockey but was useless against what Rick was actually dealing with. And Wes wasn't alone in that response. The culture around the sport, around enforcers especially, treated toughness as the answer to everything. You took hits, you got back up, you kept going. That framework had no room for someone whose hardest battle was happening before he even got to the rink. Before games, Rick would have anxiety attacks, his mind locked up on the inevitable fight, unable to enjoy anything else. The code demanded he showed up. So he did, until he couldn't anymore. By March 2011, Rick was ready to try again. The Canucks assigned him to the Manitoba Moose on a conditioning stint, and the NHL waived its usual 2-week limit, allowing him to stay with the Moose for the rest of the season. He played 11 regular season games, recorded 2 assists, and even scored a game-winning overtime goal in the AHL playoffs. To people watching from the outside, it looked like a comeback. Rick told the Winnipeg Sun during that stretch that his issues were behind him, and he wanted to make one thing absolutely clear, that there was no substance abuse involved, saying that it was the farthest thing from it. But something larger was shifting underneath him. The NHL had been trending away from fighting for years, and the enforcer role that had given Rick his identity, his paycheck, and his place in the game was shrinking. Fewer teams were carrying dedicated fighters. Roster spots for guys like Rick were disappearing. He was 27 years old with a history of leaves that every general manager in the league knew about. The math wasn't complicated. If the one thing Rick could offer the NHL was being the toughest guy willing to do the job nobody else wanted, what happened when the league decided it didn't want that job done anymore? Then Winnipeg called. The Atlanta Thrashers had just relocated to become the new Jets, and the organization shared ownership with the Manitoba Moose, a team where Rick had spent some of his best years. On July 2nd, 2011, Rick signed a 1-year, $700,000 contract. A familiar city, familiar people, a fresh start. Craig Heisinger, now the Jets' assistant general manager, had been the one who originally discovered Rick years earlier and personally helped bring him to Winnipeg. The summer of 2011 felt different for people around Rick. Jets co-owner Mark Chipman would later describe the day Rick signed as one of the best days of his summer, adding that beyond the announcement of the franchise joining the NHL, bringing Rick aboard was what really brought the whole thing full circle. Rick was planning to switch from his Canucks number 37 to number 11, the same jersey he had worn with the Regina Pats and during his early days with the Moose. That detail mattered to him. It was a return to something familiar, something that predated the worst years of his life. Jason Jaffray, a former teammate from both the Moose and the Canucks, who had also signed with the Jets that summer, spent time around Rick during those weeks and saw someone he barely recognized compared to the previous season. Jaffray later said that everyone knew Rick had dealt with some issues, but that he was definitely a new man when he came back, and that he was the happiest Jaffray had ever seen him. But Rick had told his family something he hadn't told anyone else. This was his last shot. If Winnipeg didn't work, he didn't know what came next. And the reality of starting over in a new city meant new doctors, new routines, and the disruption of whatever treatment structure had been built around him in Vancouver over the previous 3 years. The Canucks organization had been deeply involved in coordinating Rick's care since 2008, with assistant general manager Lawrence Gilman later saying that their entire organization was intimately involved in what Rick was going through, from the training staff to the coaches to management. Moving to Winnipeg meant stepping outside that network at the exact moment Rick was trying to convince everyone, including himself, that the worst was behind him. Rick was scheduled to fly to Winnipeg on August 14th to have his knee evaluated the following day. He never made the flight. When he missed his appointment on August 15th, Craig Heisinger tried to reach him. He couldn't. Later that day, a family member found Rick in his home in Crow's Nest Pass, Alberta. He was 27 years old. He had lost his battle with depression. Within hours, Canucks fans began gathering outside Rogers Arena in Vancouver, building a memorial for a player who had only suited up for 119 NHL games across 6 seasons, but had left a mark on a city that went far beyond statistics. Andrew Ladd, the Jets captain who had never even played a game alongside Rick, posted that he was looking forward to being teammates and that his thoughts were with Rick's family. Michael Grabner, a former Canuck, called Rick, pound for pound, one of the toughest guys out there. Heisinger stood at the funeral in the Alberta Stella Memorial Arena in Blairmore, the same rink where Rick had played his minor league hockey as a kid, and told the crowd of nearly 1,000 people that everyone had done as much as they could for Rick, and Rick had done as much as he could for himself. Then, he said the part that no one wanted to hear. In the end, the demon depression won out. Rick's death on August 15th did not happen in isolation. 3 months earlier, on May 13th, Derek Boogaard, a 28-year-old enforcer who had played for the Minnesota Wild and the New York Rangers, was found in his Minneapolis home after an accidental mix of painkillers and alcohol. At 6'7" and 265 pounds, Boogaard had been one of the most feared fighters in the league, but he hadn't played in months while trying to recover from concussions stained in on-ice bouts. A posthumous examination of his brain revealed CTE far more advanced than doctors had seen in other former players his age. Then, just 16 days after Rick, on August 31st, Wade Belak was found in a Toronto hotel room. Belak was 35, had played 549 career NHL games across 14 seasons, and had recently retired. His teammates described him as the most outgoing, joke-cracking presence in any locker room he walked into. 3 enforcers gone in a single summer. Georges Laraque, one of the most successful enforcers of his generation, spoke publicly in the aftermath and said something that cut through every excuse the league had ever made. He said the worst part of being an enforcer was never the fight itself, because the adrenaline kicks in and you don't feel the blows. The worst part was the night before, the day of the game. The constant pressure of knowing you would have to do it again. The inability to watch a movie or enjoy a night because your mind was already locked on the next opponent. The NHL responded. The league and the NHLPA launched hockey talks, beginning in 2012 with the Canucks and expanding across the league by 2013, an initiative started by the Vancouver Canucks specifically to honor Rick's legacy, dedicated to raising awareness about mental health and breaking the stigma around asking for help. It has since expanded to 18 NHL clubs. Players started coming forward in ways that would have been unthinkable in Rick's era. Corey Hirsch wrote openly about his decades-long battle with intrusive thoughts. Robin Lehner stood at the NHL Awards and spoke about his struggles with addiction and bipolar disorder. The enforcer role itself began to disappear from the game, not only because analytics made it strategically obsolete, but because the human cost had become impossible to defend. But the culture that trapped Rick hasn't gone away entirely. It still exists in every sport, every profession, and every community where strength is defined by silence. Remember that fight at the beginning? The one everyone saw? Rick Rypien fought over 90 times in his professional career across the WHL, AHL, and NHL. He took on men who towered over him and never once backed down. He never lost his courage. What he lost was the permission to be human. And that wasn't his failure. That was ours. If you want more stories from the ice that the league never wanted told, Skates and Scars is where they live. Subscribe, because the next one is already coming.